I have the pleasure to welcome in our special series of podcasts, Dr. Kristi Raik, the director of the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute. Thank you, Dr. Raik, for this discussion.
Thank you for the invitation.
Well, inevitably, my first question will be about the war in Ukraine and how threatened you feel now in Estonia, in the Baltics, by Russian aggression.
Well, in the Baltic states, we, of course, do see the war in Ukraine as an existential matter also for our future security, not just for Ukraine. Because Russia is not only aiming to include Ukraine in its sphere of influence, but it is also aiming to change the whole European security order. This was clearly expressed in the demands that Russia presented last December. So Ukraine is just one part of Russia's strategic goals, and it is very much likely that if Russia were successful in Ukraine, even partially, then it would be encouraged to move further with its broader ambitions in Europe. And basically we see Russia being at the moment a revisionist imperialist power that is not easily stopped. And it's not that we would be in the Baltic states concerned about an imminent attack against us. This is actually not likely at all, because at this very moment Russia has very much concentrated its forces in Ukraine. But in 1 or 2 years' time, the situation can already be quite different, and it will depend a lot on how the war in Ukraine will turn out, what the outcome will be.
We saw, and I want your opinion on that NATO, the West in general, the EU and the United States did not fully understand Vladimir Putin. Germany also. What do you think was the basic thing that they missed in what Putin wanted to do in the region?
Well, I believe for many years or even decades, there was quite a lot of wishful thinking on Russia in Europe. And here the view of the Baltic states has always been somewhat different in comparison to Western European countries. Even in the 1990s, after the end of the Cold War and collapse of the Soviet Union, when Russia was rather liberal and pursuing good relations with the West, even then we could see and experience that Russia was holding on to the idea that it was entitled to have a privileged role or some kind of sphere of influence, at least in the post-Soviet space. And this was expressed, for example, by the creation of so-called separatist republics in many of the post-Soviet states. And actually Russia also tried to create such a separatist statelet in Estonia, in northeastern part of Estonia in the first half of 1990s, but it failed to do so because the Estonian government managed to block these attempts. But then moving on, I mean, in 2000, Putin came to power, and I think from that year, we can actually observe a gradual strengthening of Russia's aspiration to restore its great power status and also to regain its influence in what Russia calls the near abroad. At the same time, another parallel trend, which is related to the kind of foreign policy trend, is the domestic trend of authoritarianism, step by step growing, and to the extent that democracy had been established in Russia in the 1990s, it started to weaken from the year 2000 onwards. And it was a steady process until today, where we are now where we can define Russia a totalitarian, not just an authoritarian state. So in the Western countries, there was for a long time somehow reluctance to take these Russian aspirations seriously. And even in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, where President Putin very clearly expressed his agenda, and then 2008, he attacked Georgia, used actually military force against the neighboring country. Still, the Western reaction was to have more engagement, more cooperation, more dialogue, because this was seen in the West as a way to kind of tame the Russian imperialist instincts and to improve security in Europe. Whereas from the Russian perspective, Russia was very determined to pursue its goals, and it was deeply unsatisfied with the way the European security architecture had been shaping during the post-Cold War era, and the Western signals of engagement were read by Russia as signs of weakness and signs that the West is not going to stop Russia from pursuing its goals in the neighboring countries.
Well, Dr. Raik, do you see now a change in the EU's and NATO's strategy following the invasion of Ukraine? Because we see that there are two approaches to the war. The one is more the approach of the United States, that Ukraine is fighting the war for all of us. And the other approach is more the Germans' approach, that we must see a way out of the war and not maybe humiliate Vladimir Putin, and see if we can come, and Emmanuel Macron has expressed that opinion, and we must have a compromise with Vladimir Putin. So do you see that the West is united in a strategy now against Russia?
The immediate reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine on 24th of February was surprisingly strong and united. It was a major shock, of course, for Western countries that Russia did actually launch a major invasion. And so the reaction involved many actually surprising elements when it comes to the very rapid decisions on very extensive, unprecedented sanctions, also the decision to move towards getting rid of the Russian fossil fuels in Europe, and the decisions taken by many countries to give military assistance to Ukraine. In some cases, like Germany, this was a very big shift in the German approach. But today, as we are more than 3 months into the war, the unity is more difficult to maintain. And there are indeed, as you referred to, different positions among the Western countries. What you named as the US perspective, actually, I would say it's a very strong perspective of the Eastern member states of the EU and NATO, countries neighboring Russia, who see the war in Ukraine as having very direct implications for their own security. And so in the Baltic states and Poland, but even I would say today quite strongly in Finland and Sweden, the understanding is that we need to do everything we can to support Ukraine and help Ukraine win this war and push back the Russian aggression. And from our point of view, a sustainable peace can be achieved only if Russia is clearly defeated. And there have been discussions among the experts about what exactly a Russian defeat would mean. But on a very general level, I would say when we talk about a strategic defeat, this means that Russia would be forced to abandon its revisionist and imperialist agenda in vis-a-vis neighboring countries. And it would be compelled to respect the sovereignty of its neighboring countries and also their territorial integrity. So these are very big principled issues for the European security order that are particularly, of course, relevant for Russia's neighboring countries. But indeed, in large European countries, France and Germany, the tone and the approach has been somewhat different. We have seen a lot of statements saying that we should not weaken Russia too much, and we should not humiliate Russia, and we should not provoke Russia too much. And this, from my perspective, it's a wrong and dangerous approach. Because one thing we should have learned from European history and from the Second World War is that if you make concessions to an aggressor, then the risk is that the appetite of the aggressor will only grow. And we have to acknowledge that the goals of Russia and on the other side, Western countries and Ukraine in this war are in conflict, they are incompatible. Unfortunately, I don't see a space for compromise with Putin's regime when it comes to the basic principles of European security order. Russia really has its own revisionist agenda and wants to change the core principles of that order and get back to a Europe of spheres of influence defined by great powers by force. That's why we keep emphasizing in the Eastern member states of both the EU and NATO that we need to further strengthen the military support to Ukraine and to help Ukraine to win this war, because this is so important for European security at large. And the idea to avoid provoking Russia sounds very odd to us, and we are not afraid of Russia's weakness. Our historical experience is that Russia has been threatening and aggressive towards its neighbors at moments where it has been relatively strong and where it has seen weakness on the side of the neighboring countries or the West. So this was the Russian assessment when it decided to invade Ukraine. It did not expect actually Ukraine to respond so strongly, and it did not expect the Western countries to respond so strongly. But when Russia sees strength on the side of the counterpart, for example, NATO is from the Russian viewpoint much stronger militarily than Russia, and Russia has a very high threshold to kind of test the resolve of NATO, because it knows it cannot win a military conflict with NATO. So in this case, Russia does not pose so much of a threat, provided that NATO maintains a credible defense on its eastern flank.
Dr. Raik, do you believe that small states like Estonia, like Greece, have limitations? You have written recently that knowing how to play the game is key to the ability of small states to punch above their weight. Can you explain a little bit that? Because I found it very, very interesting when I read it.
Yes, in Estonia, of course, we think a lot about how a small state can use its limited resources and limited weight in international relations so that it can actually promote issues that are most important for our security and our interests more broadly. And in the case of Estonia, the choice has been to integrate as closely as possible with the Western organizations, above all the EU and NATO, and then try to actively promote our priorities in these organizations. And what does it mean to kind of know how to play the game? I mean, there are many aspects to it. One is that you need to have an understanding and solidarity vis-a-vis other member states or your allies. We have different priorities within both the EU and NATO. So, for example, Estonia has made an effort to be active, at least to some extent, also in the southern neighborhood, so that it is kind of more convincing to argue that we expect solidarity from the southern European countries vis-a-vis our concerns in the east. So, for example, Estonia has been taking part in operations in Mali, and it has tried to develop its policies in the southern neighborhood in different ways. So that is part of playing the game, and the core interest for Estonia as a small country next to a difficult neighbor is always very much focused on the potentially existential threat we are facing from Russia and how to manage that and minimize the concern. But then in order to pursue our views on this issue, we need to really be constructive member states in different issues that are important for the organizations as a whole and for other member states.
Greece is also a country that has a difficult neighbor, to put it mildly, Turkey. How do you perceive in the Baltics and in your foundation, in your think tank, the revisionism of President Erdogan? Many analysts say that he wants to be like Vladimir Putin.
Well, I'm not an expert of Turkey, so I don't want to comment on what exactly is the agenda or goals of President Erdogan. But of course, we see that in the NATO context, Turkey is sometimes a difficult ally. Right now, there is the issue of Finland's and Sweden's application to join NATO, where Turkey is pursuing a really counterproductive negotiating tactic and then trying to put obstacles on the way of the two countries, which kind of raises questions about Turkey's commitment to the open door policy of NATO and also its commitment to kind of accept or share the views that in NATO generally are shared by other allies, namely in this case, the assessment of the alliance is that membership of Finland and Sweden would be welcome and would strengthen the alliance, and it is also in NATO's interest to kind of go through this process quickly in the current volatile security environment. So this is the kind of recent concrete indication of what kind of issues we have with Turkey. But on the other hand, the sense in this region, and also talking to Finnish colleagues, is that in the end we will manage to find a solution, and Turkey is not expected to actually block eventually NATO enlargement in the north.
So, Dr. Raik, I know that's my last question, that it's very, very difficult to make predictions about the war in Ukraine, but if you could, do you see the war ending soon or not?
Well, as you say, yes, it's very difficult to make predictions. Unfortunately, today, we don't really have an end or a settlement in sight yet. We've seen just in recent days new decisions by a number of Western countries to increase military aid to Ukraine. And the Ukrainians are very determined to continue their fight for freedom and for their existence. So I would expect during the next months we will see further difficult fighting on the battleground, with the aim to improve the Ukrainian positions before we can get to a situation where even a ceasefire could be in Ukraine's interest, and some kind of process to negotiate the settlement could be started. But I think it will be a long process, even when at some point the current level of intensity in the fighting will have to be reduced. Both Russia and Ukraine will soon have exhausted their ability to continue this intensity of warfare. But this does not mean that the conflict will end. As I said before, Russia is very determined to pursue its strategic goals in Ukraine and beyond, and at the same time, Ukraine is very determined to defend itself. So it will be, I'm afraid, a prolonged process where a lot is at stake for Russia and Ukraine, and also the Western countries.
Dr. Raik, thank you very much for having this discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.